Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear brothers and sisters, we are going to discuss today about reform and revival in Islamic thought throughout the history and the demands in its regard, today's demands. But before going into the discussion of reform and revival of Islamic thought, let's try to understand the very basic meaning and concept of reform and revival. What does reform mean? What does revival mean? What is the difference between reform and revival? And what are the necessities and roles of reform and revival in the society, in the human history? So, to begin with, reform is in fact a necessary response to the corruption in the society, in the human beings, in their politics, in their society, in their thought. And it is very well known that human beings are equally inclined towards corruption, evils, injustice, as they are inclined towards justice, virtue, and morality. So, whenever there is a spirit of injustice, there is a dominance of corruption and evils, there is a need of reform. Whenever there is fasad, there is need of Islah. On the other hand, revival is something related to tradition, its teachings, its contents, the way it is understood by human beings, and the way it is presented or interpreted. So we can see, or we can say that reform is something related to society, to practice, to applications, to human actions, while revival is something related to the core of tradition, the contents of the tradition. And on the very same ground of the human nature, that human nature have tendency of human natures have elements of whims and desires, passions. So they try to change tradition according to their whims and desires, and also they have element of forgetfulness, so they forget and lose. So because of this whims, desires, and forgetfulness, they change part of the tradition because of their whims, and they forget and lose part of it. So there arises the need to go back to the original of the tradition and reviving what has been forgotten or what has been changed. So there are three major domains or areas where reform is always needed and has always been taking place. Those are politics, society, and human thought. However, reform is used more generally, including both meanings, reform and revival. So I'll use reform in that general sense, using both meanings. So now coming back to the issue of Islamic reform, or reform of Islamic thought, or reform of Islamic history, or reform by Islam in the history, throughout the history. So let me be very clear that Islam in fact came to reform the society. The very purpose, goal, and aim of the Islam was to bring about change, to bring about reform, and to transform the society to a better and good place. And the core of Islam, or the Islamic tradition, has always been same throughout the history of the prophets. So Islam in itself is again a revival of the traditions of the prophet, traditions of the prophets, teachings of the prophets. And let me also state here clearly that the history of Islam, or the history of a Muslim, is history of reform, in fact, history of transformations. So from Islamic perspective, reform, the notion of reform can be justified presented on three grounds. First of all, there are certain divine texts which elucidates the meaning, the necessity and importance of reform. In fact, the verses of enjoining good and forbidding evil, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar, can be best understood in the spirit of reform. So human beings have always tendency to do corruption, to do evil, and there is always need to forbid evil, and enjoin them to good, to transform them, to resist the corruptions. And there are several prophetic traditions in the same line, same connotations, emphasizing the importance of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar and their increasing role with the passage of time. And there is a very specific prophetic tradition which in fact indicates not only the importance of reform but also the very nature of human beings which demands reform, which in fact require the process of reform. So it states that Islam came as a Islam as a project of reform with all its teachings came in a society which was full of corruptions, full of injustice. But Islam as a project of reform reformed the whole society, transformed it into a very ideal and good society. But Prophet anticipated that soon all these situations and reform will reverse back. And this project of freedom, project of justice, equality, virtue will be lost in human society, among human beings. So the whole fact from this divine text demands the necessity, demands the importance of reform, the movements of reforms. The second ground is history. History reveals the importance and necessity of reform, of transformation and change. So we can see from a very cursory reading of human history and especially in our case Muslim history that soon after the departure of the Prophet ﷺ and at the end of the period of the golden period, the period of his companions whom he trained himself in a very high manner, things started changing and deteriorating, becoming very worse. So for example, in the politics, which was first and foremost to be corrupted, we noticed that the very base and the very core of the Islamic governance, the Islamic politics, shura'iyat, consultation or freedom or equality, all were replaced and turned into despotism and tyranny, dictatorship. On the social level, we see very soon Muslim society started importing elements from other corrupted societies, which and also resulting from the ways of thinking, the other ways of thinking. And at intellectual level, we see things again started changing in the sense that people, we see example the role of original revelation, the role of wahi, the role of scriptures, and the role of thinking, the role of reasoning, the role of rationality were to a very large extent suspended and ignored or replaced with the opinions of scholars or narrations, including weak and strong, without serious discrimination among them. So in such a background of history, the movement of reform becomes very important and necessary. The third ground is human nature, as we have pointed out, that human natures being equally inclined towards bad things, towards corruption and injustice, this nature demands the constant struggles of reform among human beings. And therefore, we can say that reform is not peculiar to Islam or Muslim history, in fact. Reform is part of human society, is part of the natural phenomena of human society. So it can be observed in every society and at every age, in different degrees and in different forms. Now we will highlight some of the very outstanding and remarkable dimensions of Islamic reform in human history in all the three areas: politics, society, and thoughts. One can add more aspects though. But before that, it is very essential to understand Islam and the project of reform which Islam came with. Islam, in fact, is a complete project of human life in its private spheres as well as in its public and social spheres, in its worldly affairs as well as in its spiritual affairs. And since this is a complete project and a universal project beyond the particularities of time and space, it had to be, and it is, very flexible and dealing mainly with what can be considered as the values, principles, fundamentals, and teachings, the essence. As far as forms or models of applications are concerned, they are always historical and relative. That is how we can understand the significance of the period of Caliphate Rashidun, as the application of those fundamentals, those values, those Islamic teachings in a particular history, in a particular place. So any model or any society or any model of politics, society or thought, the ways of thinking, which go against the very basic values, teachings and principles of Islam, need to be revised and reformed. And it is important to understand the very difference between historicity of models and forms of applications of Islamic teachings and the universality and immutability of Islamic values and Islamic principles. Here it is important to mention the other meaning of reform, which can be called relevantization of Islam or Islamic teachings. So the change in time and space, the evolution in human society, the development of technology and tools of society and life, and change in social structure and social institutions and social conditions entail to rethink and revise the models and forms of applications of Islamic values and teachings. So we can say now that reform has two meanings or two ways. One is backward, where the focus is on correction of what has been changed or corrupted, and the other is forward, where the focus is on adaptation and relevantization of the Islamic teachings for the present and for any particular time according to needs and demands of the time. So now let's have a look on the reforms which Islam brought about in history. So for example, in politics, there have always been tendency among human beings, tendencies towards dictatorship, towards tyranny, preservations of the interest of a very limited number of people and ignoring all others, and exclusivity of powers in a very limited number of people. ruling class. But Islam introduced the values of shura'iyat, consultation, which requires full and open participation of all members of the society, freedom of all, freedom of expression, freedom of opinions, liberty of conscience, and also equality. Freedom also in criticizing the ruling class or the ruling people. And then equality, equal opportunity for every member of the society to hold any place or any position in the politics. So therefore the political atmosphere of participation, freedom and equality, which can be seen during the time of the Prophet or the period of Caliphate Rashidun, is something unbelievable for any person at any time of the history. At social level, there has always been tendency towards hierarchies among human beings, stratifications, social classes, among which slavery was the worst thing, where one human being considered the other human being as commodity, as property, as goods. Islam, in its project of reform, tried its best to abolish all kinds of hierarchies and stratifications, including slavery. So Islam gave a model of society where equality is the core, equality is at the central. Everyone is equal. There is no superiority and there is no inferiority. All are equal in their status and in their social class, social status. At intellectual level, human beings, mostly if not always, being captured and driven by whims, desires, blind imitations of customs, previous generations, irrational thinking. But Islam, in its project of reform, liberated or tried to liberate human minds from all these constraints. So it opened up space for reasoning, for rational thinking, enlightened by revelation, by scriptures. Now, if we see the human history in general and Muslim history in particular, we see that all these areas, all these domains have always been subject to different kinds of corruptions, distortions. And simultaneously, there have always been efforts and endeavors of reforms and change, struggles of reformations, of transformations. And there is no exception in this regard. But there is a peculiarity of Islam in this regard. Islam gave a very clear reference point, a very clear fundamental, very clear set of fundamentals and principles which help to evaluate the society. And to reform if it's needed. Whereas these fundamentals are unstable and unclear in other societies or in other traditions, in other backgrounds. So from here we can also infer that reform movements of Islam will always be clear in their basics, in their frameworks and in their fundamentals. So there will be certain established, well-defined and agreed upon foundations upon which reform will be based and carried out. But sometimes it may be that people have disagreement on certain part of those fundamentals. And the reason might be the possibility of extension of the boundaries of those fundamentals to include things which should not have been part of the fundamentals. But over a long period of development and change of the thought, they may have entered it, these boundaries of fundamentals. However, the point is, ideally speaking, there should be and there are very certain established and agreed upon foundations and fundamentals which are very important to understand and take into serious consideration. So now if we look at our own time, we see that there have been a number of movements of reform and revival of Islamic society and human society at large. And there can be different kinds of categories to study them, to analyze them, to understand them. But broadly, we can classify them into two categories. One, where there is no distinction and difference between established part and historical parts, between immutable teachings, principles, and changeable things. And second category will be where the distinction is very clear between what is established, what is immutable, and what is untouchable, and on the other hand, what is subject to change and subject to reform. So among the second kind of reform movement, we can see reform movement founded and led by Maulana Bilal Maududi rahmatullah alayh. Also in Arab world, we can see reform movements initiated by Muhammad Abduhu and Rashid Rada or founded by Hassan Banna rahmatullah alayh. The scope of reform in today's world has become very wide and large, and now it is impossible to think of individuals or a single person to carry out the whole project of reform alone, as it was assumed in certain point of history. So there is a very big demand of reform of each different of Islam, each different discipline and sector of Islamic thoughts and Islamic studies, starting from the very fundamentals of fiqh, tafsir, hadith, usul al-fiqh, usul al-tafsir, usul al-hadith, and going to the grand world of fiqh and tafsir and hadith. And at the same time, politics, society, thoughts, education. So everything is undergoing reform at a very large level and pace. At last, I would like to bring your attention to a very important point, which is peculiar to our modern structure, our modern time, and which needs to be taken seriously by those who are working for the reform of the society, who are aspiring to be part of the project of Islamic reform. Most of the history of reform, which we are familiar with, is located in a society which is very simple and plain in their structure, and the relationship between different factors are very clear and obvious. But now the world has become full of complexities, contradictions, and chaos, which many of the thinkers and social scientists would prefer to call it post-normal world. And in such a world, reform, especially in its second meaning, referring to relevantization, become extra challenging and demanding. So it needs deep understanding of the society and of the phenomena which are taking place in the society to be able to carry out the project of reform with the very spirit. May Allah bless us with the energy and guidance to be part of the reform enlightened by Islam. Thanks.